The Kansas prairie stretched endless under a sky bleached pale by the summer of 1872. Jacob Carter eased the weight of his Winchester against his shoulder, the worn leather of his boots barely whispering against the trail that wound past the barn. Dawn had just begun to pry apart the shadows between the cottonwoods when he spotted her. A woman hunched near the chicken coop, her dress frayed at the seams, fingers curled around 3 stolen eggs. She moved like a spooked Mustang, all sharp angles and coiled tension. "Plan on making an omelet," Jacob drawled, "or just admirin' my hen's handiwork." The woman jerked upright, eggs trembling in her grasp. Up close, she was younger than he'd guessed, maybe 20, but hardship had carved lines around her mouth that didn't belong. Her name was Eliza Hart, she'd spit out after a heartbeat silence, like it was a bullet she'd been holding between her teeth. Jacob noted the way her gaze darted toward the tree line, where 2 small shapes lurked children, he realized. A boy with a mess of straw-colored hair, and a girl clutching a threadbare doll. Eliza's voice turned brittle when she mentioned them. "Ain't your concern," she said, but the way her knuckles whitened around those eggs told another story. Jacob scratched at his stubble, considering. The ranch could use another pair of hands, and Lord knew the bunkhouse hadn't seen a decent meal since his last cook ran off with a whiskey drummer. "Tell you what," he said, leaning his rifle against the coop. "You can either earn those eggs scrubbing my cast-iron pans, or we can ride into Dodge City next Sunday and let the preacher make it official." Eliza's laugh was a sharp, startled thing. "You proposing to a woman who just robbed you?" "Nah," Jacob said, nodding at the children now peeking from behind a scrub oak. "I'm hiring a mother." The twist came when Eliza hesitated, not out of fear, but because the boy stepped forward, thrusting a skinned jackrabbit at Jacob with solemn dignity. "Payment," the kid muttered. Jacob took it, fighting a grin. "Fair trade." By sundown, the bunkhouse smelled of simmering stew, and the girl Lily was teaching Jacob's old cattle dog to shake hands. That night, as Eliza scrubbed the last pot, she paused. "Why?" she asked the firelight, catching the silver in her hair that hadn't been there that morning. Jacob rolled a cigarette slow. "Back in '65, I stole a pie off a windowsill in Wichita. Lady who caught me. She handed me a fork." He struck a match. "Turns out hunger makes fools of us all." Outside, the coyotes sang, and somewhere beyond the fence line, the prairie kept its secrets. The boy Boone clutched his carved wooden horse like it was the last solid thing in the world, his sister's small hand, locked in his. Eliza knelt, brushing a smudge of dirt from the girl's cheek. "This is Lily," she said, voice softer than Jacob had heard yet. "And this one here's Boone." The children stared up at him with eyes too old for their years, the kind of look that came from too many nights spent listening for trouble. Jacob tipped his hat. "Well, Miss Lily, Mr. Boone, welcome to the rocking sea." He led them to the bunkhouse, its rough-hewn logs weathered, but sturdy. "Ain't much," he admitted, kicking a warped floorboard back into place with his boot. "But the roof don't leak, and there's a stew pot that's seen worse." Eliza's fingers traced the quilt on the narrow bed, a faded Star of Texas pattern his own mother had stitched decades ago. By noon, the ranch smelled of baking soda biscuits and venison gravy. Lily perched on the porch steps, her doll propped beside her, as she sneaked scraps to Jacob's grizzled cattle dog, Samson. Boone hovered near the woodpile, watching Jacob sharpen an axe with a stone. "You fixin' to chop something?" the boy asked, edging closer. "Fixin' to try," Jacob said, flipping the axe to offer the handle. Boone's eyes widened, but he took it, hefting the weight with both hands. A memory flashed Jacob at that age, his father's calloused palms guiding his grip. He didn't mention the boy's hands were shaking. That evening, as Eliza scrubbed the cast-iron skillet, Jacob leaned in the doorway. "You ever handle a rifle?" She froze. "Enough to know which end kills." He nodded toward the mantel where his Winchester rested. "Tomorrow I'll show you proper. A woman out here ought to know how to defend what's hers. Her knuckles whitened around the dish rag. You think I'll need to? I think, he said slowly, the world's full of men who don't ask before they take. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, or maybe a wolf. Neither of them flinched. Later, under a sky thick with stars, Eliza found Jacob on the porch, whittling a piece of pine into what might have been a horse. Boone hasn't slept through the night since his pa died, she said abruptly. Tonight he's snoring like a drunk miner. Jacob blew wood shavings off his knife. Kid's got grit, held that axe like he was born to it. A silence settled between them, comfortable as old boots. Then, you ever think about leaving all this? She asked. He stilled. Every damn blizzard. Her laugh was quiet, but it lit something in his chest. When she reached for the whittling, their fingers brushed, and for a heartbeat the plains didn't feel quite so empty. Dawn came sharp and gold. Eliza was already at the stove when Jacob walked in her hair braided tight, Boone's wooden horse tucked in her apron pocket. She slid a plate of eggs toward him without a word. Through the window he saw Lily leading Samson by a string leash, the dog humoring her with exaggerated patience. Something clenched in his ribs. Not fear, not quite hope. Just the certainty that whatever storm was coming, it'd find them ready. The morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and damp earth as Eliza strode toward the barn, her boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Inside, Jacob stood currying the bay mare, his movements rhythmic and sure. Without turning, he jerked his chin toward the workbench, where a worn leather holster lay coiled like a sleeping snake. That's for you, he said. Colt .45, same one my sister carried when she ran this spread. Eliza picked it up the weight, familiar yet foreign in her hands. Your sister. Cholera took her in '68. Jacob's voice was rough as the rope burns on his palms. Last thing she said was, "Don't let the bastards steal my chickens." A ghost of a smile touched Eliza's lips as she slid the revolver into her apron pocket. Somewhere beyond the corral, Boone whooped as Samson loped after a jackrabbit, the dog's tail cutting joyful arcs through the golden grass. By noon, the ranch hummed with purpose. Eliza kneaded dough with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, the scars on her forearms gleaming pale against sun-darkened skin, a map of survival written in flesh. Lily perched on a stool, shelling peas, her small fingers working with surprising speed. "Mama," she piped up. "Mr. Jacob's got a picture book in his trunk." Eliza's hands stilled. "You weren't digging through his things, were you?" "Found it fair and square," Jacob called from the doorway, wiping axle grease from his hands with a rag. "My ma's illustrated botany journal. Girl's got an eye-recognized poison ivy right off the page." He tossed Lily a peppermint stick from his vest pocket. The girl caught it with a grin, her front teeth missing. Something warm unfurled in Eliza's chest. That afternoon, as Jacob showed her how to back the wagon team into the traces, a rider appeared on the ridge, a lean figure astride a paint horse, the brim of his hat pulled low. Jacob's posture went taut as a bowstring. "Take the children inside," he said quietly. But Eliza didn't move. She slid her hand into her apron pocket, fingers curling around the colt's checkered grip. The stranger reined up 20 yards out, his duster flapping like crow's wings. "That you, Carter?" The voice was whiskey rough. Jacob stepped forward, blocking Eliza from view. "McCready, heard you were dead." The man barked a laugh. "Wishful thinking." His gaze flicked to Eliza, then to the children peeking from the barn door. "Heard you took up babysitting, too." Jacob's hand hovered near his hip. "State your business." McCready spat tobacco, the brown stain blooming in the dust. "Just delivering a message. The Clayton boys are riding this way. They remember what you did to their cousin." He wheeled his horse, adding over his shoulder, "Might want to hide those pretty new chickens of yours." As the rider disappeared in a cloud of ochre dust, Eliza exhaled sharply. "You got a history with those Claytons." Jacob's jaw worked. "Same history every honest man's got with thieves." He met her eyes, and in that moment she saw the truth. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Lily's small hand slipped into Eliza's sticky with peppermint. The child's whisper was barely audible. "We ain't running, are we, Mama?" Eliza squeezed her fingers. "No, baby, we ain't." At sundown, they ate in silence, the weight of tomorrow pressing down like a coming storm. Jacob cleaned his Winchester at the table, the metallic snick of the lever action punctuating the quiet. Eliza set a slice of apple pie in front of him, his mother's recipe found in that same trunk. He stared at it like it was a holy relic. "Figured you could use some sweetness," she said. For the first time since Macready rode in, Jacob smiled. It changed his whole face, carving out the years of loneliness. Outside, the first coyotes began to sing, their voices weaving through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the dark, Samson growled low in his throat. Eliza didn't reach for the revolver this time. She simply finished her coffee, watching the shadows stretch long across the land she'd begun, against all odds, to call home. The evening light bled crimson across the prairie as Jacob tightened the gelding's cinch. Inside the cabin, Eliza's knife thunked rhythmically against the cutting board, the sound carrying through the open door. "Gonna check the line traps before dark," he called. She looked up carrot greens sticking to her wrist. "I'll keep supper warm." Jacob hesitated, then jerked his head toward the door. "Come with me." The mare he'd saddled for Eliza stood patient as a saint, her dappled gray coat silver in the fading light. They rode in companionable silence until the trail dipped into a willow hollow, where the air smelled of damp earth and wild mint. "You always this quiet?" Eliza finally asked, her voice cutting through the whisper of grass. "Got out of the habit of talking," Jacob admitted. The gelding sidestepped a prairie dog hole. "Spent 2 years up in Montana trapping beaver. Only company I had was a mule named Judas, who bit." Eliza's laugh startled a killdeer from the brush. "Judas, huh? Named him after the preacher who sold me that damn mule." Jacob's mouth quirked. Took 6 months before he'd let me saddle him without trying to break my ribs. At the trap line, Jacob knelt to free a plump jackrabbit from the snare. Eliza crouched beside him, her skirts pooling in the dust. "Why'd you really ask me to come?" The question hung between them, like gun smoke. Jacob reset the trap with deliberate movements. "Figured you ought to know where the traps are set, in case." He didn't finish. "In case them Claytons show up while you're gone." Eliza's fingers brushed the colt at her hip. The fading light caught the silver streaks in her hair new, since the children came to the ranch. They turned back as the sky turned the color of bruised plums. Beneath them, the horses' hooves kicked up the scent of crushed sage. Ahead, the cabin windows glowed like harvest moons. Through the open door, they could see Lily standing on a stool to stir the stew pot, her tongue poked out in concentration. Boone slept curled under Jacob's old cavalry blanket, his breathing even for the first time in weeks. Eliza reined up suddenly. "That preacher still come by on Sundays." Jacob's pulse jumped. "Twice a month, regular as taxes." She studied the horizon where the first stars pricked through. "Might be we should have words with him." When Jacob didn't reply, she added, "Not for me. For the children. A name matters out here." Inside, Lily had set the table with 3 tin plates instead of 2. The stewpot simmered obediently. Jacob hung his hat on the peg by the door, his throat tight. He'd forgotten what it felt like to come home to something more than silence. 3 days later, as they loaded the wagon for town, Eliza pressed a bundle into Jacob's hands, his good shirt freshly mended. "Lily picked the thread," she said. "Blue like your eyes." The girl beamed from the porch steps where she counted beans into a jar, her small fingers precise as any banker's. Jacob opened his mouth, but the words stuck. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in that old, instinctive gesture of respect. The morning sun caught the gold in Eliza's hair as she climbed onto the wagon seat, her back straight as a rifle barrel. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rumbled, not a threat, but a promise. The land was waking up. The wagon creaked along the rutted trail to town dust, rising in slow curls behind them. Eliza sat stiff beside Jacob, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden seat. The prairie stretched endless around them, the only movement a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals high above. "Cooper's got that barrel I need," Jacob said, squinting against the glare. "And we'll see about that cloth for Boone's coat." Eliza nodded, watching the hawk bank sharply. "Girl needs new shoes, too. Her toes are starting to curl under." Jacob glanced at her profile, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her sun-bleached lashes caught the light. "You ever think about—" "Don't." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Not yet." The town emerged from the heat haze, like a mirage-weathered clapboard buildings leaning into the wind, the mercantile's false front peeling in the sun. Jacob tied the team to the hitching post, its wood gnawed smooth by generations of restless horses. Inside the store smelled of coal oil and cinnamon. A tow-headed boy, barely taller than the counter, nodded. "Afternoon, Mr. Carter." Ma's out back sorting feed. Eliza moved toward the fabric bolts, her calloused fingers testing the weave of a sturdy blue wool. Behind her, Jacob hefted a new rain barrel, the iron bands gleaming. "That one'll do," she said, holding up the blue cloth. "Matches his eyes." Jacob added it to their pile without comment, then paused by a display of tin whistles. Eliza shook her head before he could speak. "Boone's happy with that carved horse of his." At the counter, Jacob traded eggs and $2 silver for their goods. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the metallic tang of coming rain. "You don't ask for much," Jacob said as they loaded the wagon. Eliza tucked the fabric inside her coat. "Had that habit beaten out of me young." Jacob stepped close enough to smell the lavender soap she'd started using. "This ain't that place." His voice dropped. "And I ain't that man." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they turned for home. The horses sensed the storm, their ears flicking nervously. Jacob drove one-handed, the other resting near his thigh, where his colt hung a habit from the old days. They found Lily on the porch, Boone asleep in her lap, the girl's bare feet swinging just above the planks. She'd tied Samson's leash to the rail, the dog standing guard, like a shaggy sentinel. That night by lantern light in the bunkhouse, Eliza measured and cut with careful precision. Boone's breath came easy beside her, no longer rattling with that damp cough. Lily pored over Jacob's botany book, tracing the illustrations with reverent fingers. Outside, the wind howled through the cottonwoods, but inside the fire held. And for the first time, in longer than she'd admit, Eliza found herself believing in tomorrow. The knock came just as the last embers faded in the bunkhouse stove. Eliza opened the door to find Jacob holding a steaming tin cup, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Thought you might need this," he said, pressing the warm cider into her hands. The scent of apples and cinnamon curled between them. She took a sip, the heat spreading through her chest. Behind her, Lily murmured in her sleep, one small hand clutching the botany book to her chest. Jacob stood hat in hand, the moonlight silvering the scars on his knuckles. "You ever think about what comes after winter?" he asked quietly. Eliza studied the dark horizon, where the first stars burned cold and bright. "I do now," she admitted. He shifted his weight boots, crunching on the frosted ground. "I ain't talking about just fixing fences or breeding stock. I mean, building something that lasts." His gaze dropped to where Boone slept curled beneath the quilt she'd patched with blue cloth. "Something worth passing on." The wind rattled the dry cottonwood leaves as Eliza stepped onto the porch. She could still taste the cider on her tongue, sharp and sweet. "I was a nurse before I was a wife," she said suddenly. "Tended soldiers at Fort Laramie when the fever came through." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "I won't spend my life wiping another man's brow." Jacob's laugh was a soft huff of steam. "Hell, woman, I'd trust you to stitch me up quicker than that sawbones in town." He sobered, meeting her eyes. "I don't need tending. I need someone who knows how to fight for what's theirs." The quiet between them thrummed like a plucked wire. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. Eliza reached out her fingertips, brushing the rough wool of his coat sleeve. "Ask me again when the snow's deep," she whispered. Jacob's nod was barely visible in the moonlight. "I will." Dawn came brittle and bright. Eliza moved through the pre-darkness with practiced quiet wrapping Boone's new coat around his shoulders. The boy sighed in his sleep, his cheeks flushed pink with warmth. Outside the pump handle wore a sleeve of ice that cracked under her grip. She found Jacob in the woodyard, his axe flashing in the lantern light as he split kindling. Without a word, she pulled on work gloves and steadied the next log. Their rhythm developed naturally, his swing her brace the clean crack of seasoned oak giving way. As the sun crested the ridge, Eliza tilted her face toward its weak warmth. "Used to dream of California," she admitted. "Someplace where oranges grow wild." Jacob paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Stagecoach leaves Tuesdays from Dodge." She laughed, then the sound startling a flock of juncos from the barn roof. "Turns out I'd miss the way snow makes everything quiet." They hauled the split wood to the house in companionable silence. Inside, Eliza stirred the oatmeal while Jacob scrubbed pitch from his hands. The domesticity of it should have felt strange. Instead, it settled into her bones like something she'd always known. As Jacob shrugged into his coat, his fingers brushed the new holster at her hip, the one he'd fashioned from the leftover blue cloth. "Creek's running high, after that wind," he warned. Eliza checked the Colt's load with a practiced twist of her wrist. "I know where the quicksand pits are." Their eyes met in unspoken understanding. The Claytons would come. The winter would be hard. But for now there was wood to stack and cattle to gather and children to feed. And come deep snow, there would be another question asked. And this time, an answer ready. The morning air bit sharp as Eliza knelt in the frosted grass, her knife slicing through the last stubborn stalks of echinacea. The neighbor's wife had taken the children without fuss, just a knowing glance at the rifle slung across Eliza's back. Some things didn't need explaining in this country. She didn't hear the horse until its shadow crossed her work. Jacob sat tall in the saddle, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Yearling got tangled in the west fence," he said, offering his reins. "Wires tore up bad." Eliza stood brushing ice crystals from her skirt. Her fingers ached from the cold, two already bleeding from barbed wire. "I'll hold the posts while you twist." They found the heifer bawling, where the fence had snapped the broken wire coiled like a rattler ready to strike. Jacob anchored the post, while Eliza wrestled the steel strands, her hands turning slick with blood and frost. "Never figured that egg thief would be saving my cattle." Jacob said, his voice rough with something warmer than the morning air. Eliza yanked the wire taut. "Never figured a man who caught me stealing would offer me his name." The wind carried the scent of snow as they worked their breaths mingling in the space between them. When the last splice held, Jacob didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a braided leather cord, its surface worn smooth by years. "My pa wore this when he staked his first claim." He said the words quiet as falling snow. "Ain't much, but—" Eliza held out her wrist. "It's everything." The knot settled against her pulse like a promise. Around them, the prairie held its breath. The frozen grass, the distant cottonwoods, even the wind seemed to pause as Jacob's calloused fingers lingered on her wrist. "You're sure?" She met his gaze, the years of running finally stilled. Never been more sure of anything. The walk back to the ranch stretched long and golden in the late afternoon light. Somewhere ahead, smoke curled from the chimney. Lily would have the stew simmering by now. Boone, no doubt, helping by dropping carrots into the pot. At the porch steps, Eliza hesitated. Jacob's hand found hers, their palms fitting together, like the land fit the sky, inevitable necessary. Inside, the children slept curled together like puppies, Lily's arm thrown protectively over her brother. Eliza touched the braided leather at her wrist, then reached for the quilt. Tomorrow would bring frozen pipes and hungry coyotes. The Claytons' threat still looming like storm clouds. But tonight, as Jacob's fingers laced through hers and the fire crackled against the gathering dark. She finally understood what home could feel like. Outside, the first real snow began to fall, blanketing the prairie in quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. The preacher came with the dawn, his chestnut gelding picking its way through the fresh snow. Jacob met him at the gate, the frozen grass snapping under his boots. Inside, the smell of cinnamon apples and wood smoke wrapped around them like a promise. Eliza stood by the hearth in her mother's mended dress, sage green, like the first spring grass, her damp hands twisting once, before she stilled them. Lily fussed with a sprig of winterberry tucked behind her ear, while Boone pressed his face into Jacob's denim-clad leg, his wooden horse clutched tight. No lace, no rings, just the preacher's worn Bible and 4 pairs of eyes watching as Jacob took Eliza's work-rough hands in his. "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked, his breath fogging in the cold air. Jacob's thumb traced the fresh scar on Eliza's palm where the barbed wire had bitten. "I do." Her answer came clear as a bell. Yes, when the preacher left with his payment of honey and flour, the wind carried the first flakes of the coming storm. Inside, the stew pot bubbled as Lily carefully ladled portions, her tongue poking out in concentration. Boone rocked his horse across the floorboards, making soft clip-clop sounds through his nose. That night, Jacob led Eliza outside, beneath a sky so full of stars it seemed they might drip like melted butter. The lantern light caught the new braided leather around her wrist, the one that matched the faded one around his. "Built this place hoping," he said, his voice rough. "Mostly just got used to the quiet." Eliza leaned into him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. The cold bit at their cheeks, but where their hands joined, warmth spread. "I forgot what home felt like," she admitted. Jacob turned her toward him, his calloused palms framing her face. In the golden lantern glow, he looked younger somehow, the years of loneliness smoothed away. "Ain't forgetting again," he murmured before kissing her slow and sure as sunrise. Later, in the creaking iron bed that had been his father's, Eliza let her hair down for the first time in years. The children slept soundly in the bunkhouse, Samson's bulk a living blanket between them. Jacob traced the scar on her shoulder from the Fort Laramie infirmary, his touch feather-light. "You're staying," she whispered, more statement than question. His answer came in the way he pulled her close, not with the desperate grip of a man afraid to lose, but with the easy certainty of someone who'd finally found what he didn't know he was missing. Outside, the snow fell steady, wrapping the ranch in a silence that wasn't empty anymore, but full of breath and heartbeat, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that after years of wandering, they'd all finally come home. Spring came gentle that year, the thaw revealing patches of earth where Eliza's herbs pushed through the damp soil, sage and lavender, where before there'd only been hard-packed dirt. Lily, now near 10, tended her own small plot of marigolds, their orange faces turned toward the sun. Boone, all knees and elbows, followed Jacob like a shadow, his wooden horse forever tucked in his back pocket. The new chicken coop stood bright in the morning light, its fresh whitewash gleaming. Lily's painted flower, a lopsided sunflower with too many petals, had faded some, but Jacob wouldn't let anyone touch it up. Every evening, when he latched the hens in safe, his fingers brushed that crooked blossom like it was scripture. One golden evening, as fireflies blinked awake in the tall grass, Eliza found Jacob at the far fence, his leather gloves worn through at the thumbs again. She came barefoot through the clover, her skirt hem damp with dew. Without a word, she pressed her face against his sun-warmed back, her arms circling his waist. Jacob stilled the hinge pin halfway home. "Something wrong?" Eliza shook her head, her cheek moving against his sweat-damp shirt. "Just remembering that first winter." She felt his chest rise and fall in a quiet laugh. "You were all sharp edges and suspicion," he murmured, turning in her arms. His hands, rough with work, framed her face with surprising tenderness. "And you were quieter than a stone." She caught his wrist, her thumb finding the faded leather bracelet that matched hers. Never thought we'd get here. Beyond them, the children's laughter carried from the creek where they'd gone to hunt tadpoles. The kitchen window stood open, the scent of fresh bread and simmering blackberries drifting through the screen. Jacob kissed her. Then, not like the first time, full of wonder, but like a man who knew exactly what he held. When they parted, Eliza kept her eyes closed a moment longer, memorizing the feel of his calloused palm against her cheek, the way his heartbeat thudded steady against her own. Years later, when travelers asked about the ranch with the sunflower-painted coop and the lavender growing wild by the porch, townsfolk would smile. The Carters, they'd say. Good people, the kind who know the value of a second chance. And if visitors happened by during first snow, they might see Eliza and Jacob standing silent at the fence line, their intertwined fingers speaking what words never could of eggs stolen and given freely of frost, and forgiveness of a love that grew not in spite of the scars, but because of them. But that was later. Tonight there were fireflies to catch bread to break, and a whole lifetime of mornings waiting to unfold. The prairie wind played with the loose strands of Isabella's hair as she stood in the dusty churchyard, her fingers tracing the nearly invisible seam on her green dress. Jedediah's hands, usually so sure with hammer and rope, fumbled slightly as he fastened the small sprig of blue flax flowers at her waist. "Never thought I'd see the day," murmured Mrs. Carver, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen 3 generations of weddings. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. No organ music, no rice throwing, just the creak of the pastor's knees as he knelt to bless them, and the distant call of a meadowlark through the open window. When Jedediah kissed his bride, his hands hovered at her elbows like he was afraid she might vanish if he held too tight. Back at the homestead, golden light spilled across the porch, where Isabella's carefully tended flowers now bloomed in defiant color against the weathered wood. She paused at the steps, her hand resting on the sun-warmed rail Jedediah had replaced last spring. "You seeing ghosts?" he asked quietly, coming up behind her. Isabella shook her head, pressing the wedding bouquet into the chipped enamel mug they used for pencil holders and spare nails. Just remembering how this place felt that first winter. The mug clinked against the table as she set it down. All echoes and empty corners. Jedediah's boots were loud on the floorboards as he crossed to her. When he turned her face toward the window, the setting sun painted them both in gold. Outside her children now chased fireflies through the tall grass, their laughter floating in through the screen door. That night they sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch bench, watching the stars emerge one by one. Isabella leaned into him, her temple resting against the faded flannel over his heart. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a coyote yipped its voice, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. "Funny thing," she murmured. "Spent half my life running but never knew what home was until you said, 'Stay.'" Jedediah's arm tightened around her. In the distance, the western road stretched empty beneath the moonlight. Trouble would come someday. It always did. But tonight there was only the creak of the porch swing, the scent of Isabella's hair soap mingling with wood smoke, and the quiet understanding that this patch of earth beneath their feet was no longer just land to be worked, but a life to be lived. Years later, travelers would remark on the ranch with the riot of wildflowers by the porch and the blue-painted shutters. The Harts, old-timers would say, spitting tobacco into the dust. Good folk, the kind who know broken things can be mended stronger than before. And if you stayed for supper, you might notice how Isabella's hand always found Jedediah's when passing the salt, or how he still tucked a fresh wildflower into that chipped mug every Sunday morning. Small reminders that the best loves aren't shouted, but built slow and sure, like a well-laid stone fence, one careful rock at a time.